The winter of 1891 had come early to the high valleys of Idaho, settling into the land with the kind of certainty that left no room for argument. Snow lay deep between the pines, hard-packed and blue under the moon, and the mountains rose around the valley like walls meant to keep a man where he stood. Ethan Rowan had chosen this place for that very reason. He lived where roads ended and questions stopped following. His cabin stood alone at the edge of a timberline, built with his own hands years earlier, when solitude still felt like relief. The logs had darkened with age, the roof sagged slightly under the weight of ice, and the small corral nearby held two horses that knew the sound of storms as well as he did. That night the wind came down from the peaks without warning, screaming through the trees and driving snow sideways across the land. It rattled the shutters and made the walls creak as if testing their resolve. Ethan had brought the animals in before dusk, working by instinct more than thought. He had split extra wood, banked the fire high, and shut the world outside with the solid bar across his door. He moved through his evening with practiced calm, mending tack by firelight, his hands steady, his thoughts quiet. Loneliness no longer announced itself to him. It had become part of the air, something he breathed without noticing. When the sound came, it cut through the storm with unnatural clarity. It was not loud, it did not demand attention. It was small, almost fragile, and for that reason it unsettled him more than any shout could have. Ethan froze where he sat, his fingers still curled around the leather in his hands. The wind howled and pressed against the cabin, but beneath it was a rhythm that did not belong to weather. He rose slowly, listening. The horses shifted in the corral, uneasy. Snow hissed against the walls. Then the sound came again, weaker than before, as if whatever had made it was running out of strength. No one traveled these roads in winter storms. Anyone with sense waited them out or died trying to outrun them. Ethan reached for his coat and pulled it on without hurry, his movements controlled, deliberate. Years of hard living had taught him caution, and isolation had sharpened it. He lifted the rifle from its place by the door, not in fear, but habit. When he opened the door, the storm struck him full in the face. Snow blasted into the cabin, stinging his eyes and stealing his breath. He stepped forward into the doorway, scanning the white blur beyond the threshold. For a moment he saw nothing at all, just wind and darkness and movement without shape. Then he saw her. She stood, or tried to, on legs that barely held her upright. Snow clung to her coat and hair, crusted thick along the hem of her dress. Her head was bowed, dark strands frozen stiff against her face, and one gloved hand gripped a small bag, as if letting go would send her sliding back into the night. She looked less like someone who had arrived than someone the storm had carried and forgotten to finish with. Ethan lowered the rifle without thinking. The world narrowed to the simple fact of her presence, to the way she swayed where she stood. He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and caught her just as her strength failed. She was lighter than he expected, her body rigid with cold, her breath shallow and uneven. He turned and pulled her inside, forcing the door shut against the wind, sealing the storm back where it belonged. The cabin felt suddenly too small. He laid her near the fire and fed it until the flames climbed high, the heat sharp and immediate. Her skin was icy beneath his hands, cold sunk deep past the surface, and her limbs trembled with a violence that spoke of how close she had come to not knocking at all. Ethan worked without panic, guided by instinct and necessity, stripping away wet layers and wrapping her in every blanket he owned. As the warmth crept back into the room, color returned slowly to her face. Her breathing steadied, though her body still shook, and a faint crease appeared between her brows, as if even unconsciousness could not release her from effort. Ethan watched her from a distance, sitting back on his heels, aware of a weight settling into his chest that had nothing to do with responsibility alone. He had lived for years without interruption. Storms had come and gone. Winters had passed. He had learned to trust the silence and the patterns of survival it demanded, but the presence of this woman altered the balance of the space around him. The cabin no longer felt like a refuge built to keep the world out. It felt like a place where the world had forced its way back in. Outside, the wind continued its assault, relentless and indifferent. Inside, Ethan sat by the fire, listening to the crack of burning wood and the faint, fragile sound of another person breathing. He understood with a clarity that left no room for denial that whatever followed this night would not be undone. The door had been opened, and the life he had constructed in careful isolation had already begun to fracture. Morning, he knew, would arrive different than it ever had before. Morning came slowly, filtered through clouds heavy with snow and the pale light of a sun that offered no warmth. The storm had not ended, only settled into a steady, punishing rhythm. Ethan woke on the floor near the hearth, the fire reduced to glowing embers. For a moment he lay still, disoriented by the unfamiliar weight in the room. Then he remembered. The woman slept in his bed. She lay wrapped in blankets, her breathing shallow but even, her face turned slightly toward the wall as if she were already trying to make herself small. The color had returned to her cheeks, though her skin remained pale, marked by cold and exhaustion. Ethan rose quietly and added wood to the fire, watching the flames catch and climb. The sound seemed too loud in the close space, and he moved with care, as if noise itself might undo what little safety the cabin offered. As the room warmed, signs of her presence began to register in ways he could not ignore. Her damp coat hung near the door, darkened and stiff. Her boots sat side by the hearth, snow melting into the floorboards beneath them. These small disruptions unsettled him more than the storm outside. For years, every object in the cabin had remained exactly where he left it. Now the order had shifted, subtly but permanently. When she finally stirred, it was without urgency. Her eyes opened and closed again, adjusting to the light, to the unfamiliar ceiling overhead. Ethan remained by the stove, giving her space without leaving. He had faced danger in many forms, but this was different. This was not something he could fight or outrun. It required patience, restraint, and a kind of attention he had not practiced in a long time. She woke fully some time later, sitting up slowly, careful not to move too fast. Her hands trembled as she gathered the blankets around herself, instinctively guarding what little warmth she had reclaimed. Ethan set food and drink within reach, stepping back once it was done. He watched as she took them in small amounts, her movements precise, controlled by a will that refused to give in to weakness even after the night she had survived. As strength returned, so did awareness. She took in the cabin with quiet observation, her gaze lingering on the rough walls, the narrow table. Later, when she was able to stand, she moved through the space slowly, respecting its limits. She kept close to the fire, folding blankets, adjusting the kettle when it threatened to boil over. These were small acts, easily overlooked, yet they altered the rhythm of the day. Ethan found himself pausing in his work, aware of how the cabin responded to a second person. The silence changed. It no longer pressed in on him. It held. From what little she revealed through her actions, it was clear she had come a long way. Her hands were unmarked by heavy labor, yet they did not shy away from it. She worked with focus and restraint, as if determined not to be seen as a burden. There was a careful dignity in the way she carried herself, one that did not depend on comfort or security. Ethan spent the day moving between the cabin and the outbuildings, tending to the animals, hauling water, breaking ice where it had crept into places it did not belong. Each time he returned, he felt the difference her presence made. The cabin held warmth longer, the fire stayed fed, the air felt less empty. As night approached again, the storm remained unbroken. Snow continued to fall, erasing tracks as soon as they formed, sealing the valley in white. Ethan understood that she could not leave, not yet. The knowledge settled heavily, not as a problem to solve, but as a fact to accept. He prepared another place to sleep for himself without comment, moving his bedroll closer to the hearth. She noticed, of course. The awareness passed between them without words. There was gratitude in the way she arranged the blankets, and something like relief in the way she finally allowed herself to rest. When darkness closed in, the cabin filled with the quiet sounds of shared survival, the crackle of fire, the wind against the walls, two separate breaths rising and falling under the same roof. Ethan lay awake long after the fire burned low. He stared up at the beams overhead, listening to the storm and to the subtle presence of the danger announced itself with the sound of hooves cutting through frozen ground. Ethan heard it long before the riders came into view. The rhythm was deliberate, unhurried, the kind that belonged to men who did not fear resistance. He stepped outside as the sound grew closer, the cold air biting into his lungs. The storm had finally loosened its grip on the valley, leaving behind a world sealed in white and silence. Tracks stood out clearly now, impossible to hide. 3 figures emerged from the line of trees and moved toward the cabin with practiced ease. The lead rider sat tall in the saddle, his posture marked by ownership rather than effort. Even at a distance, Ethan recognized the type. Money carried differently than strength, and this man wore it openly. His horse was well fed, his coat heavy and clean, his presence sharp against the raw simplicity of the land. Marilyn stood in the doorway behind Ethan. The moment she saw the riders, something in her posture changed. Fear passed through her, quick and undeniable, but it did not take root. She straightened, drawing her shoulders back, as if reminding herself that she had already survived the worst of him. The valley was quiet enough that Ethan could feel the tension settle between them, thick and unmoving. The man dismounted with no sign of caution. He crossed the space between horse and porch, as if the ground itself owed him passage. His gaze moved past Ethan and fixed on Marilyn with a certainty that stripped her of distance and privacy. There was no hesitation in him, no doubt. To him, this was unfinished business, a transaction interrupted but not canceled. The air around the cabin shifted. What had been shelter only moments before became a line drawn in the snow. Ethan felt the weight of the choice he had avoided for most of his life press in on him. He had built this place to escape men like this, to live beyond the reach of their claims and assumptions. He knew how to yield, how to step aside and let power move past him. It was a skill learned young and perfected over time. But yielding now would not return things to the way they had been. It would erase something that had only just begun to exist. Marilyn did not step back. She moved forward instead, stopping beside Ethan, her presence steady and deliberate. The cold wind lifted the edge of her coat, but she remained still, grounded in the frozen earth. The woman who had collapsed in the snow days earlier was gone. In her place stood someone who understood exactly what was being threatened and what it would cost to surrender. The man spoke at length, his gestures sharp, his certainty absolute. He carried himself as someone accustomed to being obeyed, to seeing resistance crumble under pressure. He made claims without restraint, as if the act of stating them made them true. His words rolled over the space between them, heavy with expectation. Ethan listened without moving. He felt Marilyn's presence beside him, not as something he needed to shield, but as a force aligned with his own. The realization surprised him. This was no longer a matter of hospitality or obligation. It was a boundary, clearly marked and deliberately held. When Ethan finally stepped forward, it was not with anger but resolve. He placed himself fully between the rider and the doorway, between the past and whatever future was struggling to take shape. His stillness carried more weight than any threat. The land had shaped him into something solid, something difficult to move. The man's confidence faltered, just enough to be noticed. He had expected fear, negotiation, retreat. What he found instead was resistance, rooted not in bravado, but in refusal. He glanced around the valley, perhaps measuring isolation, perhaps calculating risk. For the first time, the ground beneath his certainty shifted. The confrontation did not end there. It could not. But something irreversible had happened in that moment. Lines had been crossed and others drawn. The man remounted his horse with a promise carried in his posture, not his words. He turned back toward the trees, his men following, the sound of hooves fading slowly into the distance. The valley exhaled. Marilyn remained where she was, her breath unsteady but her stance. The valley remained cloaked in winter, but the world beyond Ethan's cabin had begun to shift. The quiet that once offered him sanctuary no longer belonged to him alone. Word traveled slowly through the mountains and across frozen streams, but it traveled nonetheless. Men who had assumed control of deals and debts in distant towns now murmured his name, speculating about the woman he sheltered, measuring the worth of a lone rancher against the claim of the past. The air seemed heavier, every gust carrying whispers that the storm outside had only begun to loosen. Ethan felt it in the weight of his own isolation. Years of solitude had built walls around him, walls of routine and certainty that were almost sacred. He had lived alone long enough to know the rhythms of the valley, the way snow settled over the creek, the sound of the wind as it traveled through the pines. Those patterns had offered comfort, a guarantee that nothing unexpected could disturb him. But the footsteps of rumor had no respect for comfort, no regard for the fences he built around his life. Marilyn moved cautiously through the cabin, careful not to disturb the small order Ethan had established. Every act of hers, no matter how mundane, carried intention. Her eyes lingered on him, searching for signals she could not name. She had come into this valley with nothing, driven by necessity and a stubborn insistence on survival. Yet even in this remote place, the reach of the past had followed her, reminding her that refuge was never guaranteed, that safety required more than just walls and fire. Ethan observed her without words. He had known women before, fleeting presences that could vanish with a single turn of fate. Marilyn was different. She bore her history without shame, without breaking, and yet he could see the weight she carried. It was not just the physical toll of the storm, the frost-bitten fingers or the shivering shoulders. It was the sum of every expectation, every betrayal, every demand placed on her before she had ever set foot in this valley. As the evening settled over the cabin, the fire's glow stretched across rough-hewn walls, illuminating the space where two lives now intersected. Ethan's mind traced the possibilities, the outcomes that had once seemed irrelevant. Escape was no longer an answer. The valley could not hide them from judgment or from those who claimed authority. Retreat would not erase what had already begun, and silence would not protect either of them. Marilyn paused at the edge of the room, adjusting a blanket around her shoulders. There was a momentary hesitation in her posture, a flicker of doubt that passed as quickly as it came. She had learned to trust herself in the harshest conditions, to act with precision when the consequences of inaction were severe. Yet here, in the warmth of the cabin, with the snow pressing against the timbers, she sensed a choice forming, one that demanded more than caution, more than avoidance. Ethan moved closer, not to intervene, but to stand in parallel with her resolve. The valley outside had hardened him, sharpened him against the ordinary trials of life. Now it asked him to be more than a survivor. It demanded decisiveness, an assertion that the life he had built could not be undone by anyone who sought to impose fear. He felt the truth of it settle in his chest. The storm they had weathered together was only the beginning. The silence between them carried weight. Words were unnecessary to convey the understanding that had crystallized over nights of firelight and frost-bitten mornings. Each recognized the stakes: to remain, to protect, to face what came next together meant risking everything. Yet the alternative, a solitary surrender to the cold and to the expectations of others, was far worse. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the shutters with the same force it had when Marilyn first appeared on the doorstep. The sound was no longer just a signal of nature's cruelty. It became a reminder that the valley demanded action, that winter would not wait, and that the past would not stay buried. The two of them, standing side by side in the heart of the cabin, acknowledged this in a way that did not require speech. In the quiet, a pact formed without name or ceremony. They would face what approached together, understanding that the cost could be greater than either had anticipated. The valley, the storm, the unrelenting winter, all were elements of a world that could crush them, and yet, in that pressure, something unbreakable had begun. For the first time, Ethan did not seek solitude. For the first time, Marilyn did not seek to flee. In the harsh light of the fire and the longer shadows cast by snow-laden timbers, the truth became undeniable. The only way forward was together, no matter the danger. The night stretched on, endless and patient, while the valley outside waited to test the limits of their decision. Inside, they found a rhythm that neither had expected, a measured breathing of two hearts aligned, a quiet defiance against the world beyond the cabin walls. Every glance, every small gesture reaffirmed the understanding that had taken root. They would not abandon one another, and the storm would not dictate the outcome of lives shaped by courage and choice. As the fire died to embers and the wind whispered across the frozen slopes, the certainty settled fully into their bones. They would stand together when morning came. They would face those who thought possession could define a person, and they would endure the valley's long winter not as solitary figures, but as a union forged in shared resistance. In that understanding, escape was no longer an option, and neither of them wished it to be. The tension that had lingered over the valley for days finally reached a point where it could no longer be contained. The past had arrived not as a memory, but as a force, riding through the snow-laden hills with determination and threat in every step. Yet what it brought with it revealed a truth Ethan had long avoided. He was never truly alone. The valley, with its hidden hollows and winding trails, held others who understood the cost of labor, the weight of integrity, and the quiet strength that came from standing for what was right. Neighbors emerged from cabins and barns, from fields where frost clung stubbornly to fences and crops, their faces hardened by years of toil and perseverance. Their presence did not bring confrontation, but a steadfast support that shifted the balance. The air seemed to change as the familiar sounds of boots crunching through deep snow and the creak of wagon wheels echoed across the hills. Fear, which had gripped Ethan and Marilyn with invisible hands, loosened its hold as the realization settled in. They were part of a community that recognized loyalty and courage, and that recognition carried power beyond the reach of any solitary adversary. Marilyn, standing beside Ethan in the threshold of the cabin, no longer seemed fragile. The snow-dusted wind had left its mark on her hair and cheeks, but it could not touch the resolve in her posture. She had become part of the land in a way that transcended ownership or heritage. Every line of her body, every careful motion of tending the fire or gathering provisions spoke of someone who belonged, not by chance, not by accident, but by the deliberate choice to claim her place in this harsh, uncompromising valley. Ethan observed the shift with a quiet reverence. The isolation he had once embraced as protection now felt unnecessary, almost foreign. The land itself, familiar in its silence and its storms, seemed to affirm her presence. Tracks in the snow, the way the wind carried the scent of pine and frozen earth, the subtle shifts in the light over the ridges, all seemed to acknowledge her claim, her bond to the place that had shaped him and now shaped them together. As the sun dipped low behind distant peaks, the valley seemed to exhale. The confrontation that had loomed like a shadow across the cabin walls lost its edge in the presence of those who would stand alongside them. Ethan and Marilyn moved with the certainty that comes from shared purpose, their choices mirrored in the steadfast eyes of those around them. Trust, once a fragile ember, grew steady and unshakable. The storm of human conflict had passed, leaving only the quiet, enduring rhythms of the land. Snow crunched under boots, doors opened to welcome neighbors, and the hearth glowed against the growing cold. The valley remembered its own, those who worked, who protected, who honored the balance between survival and compassion. Marilyn, once a stranger, was no longer an outsider. She had become part of the story the land told, a story etched into every slope, every ridge, every snow-filled hollow. Ethan felt the weight of it settle over his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a recognition of connection. The past had tested them, threatened them, demanded that they act, but in the heart of the valley, with its quiet witnesses and patient slopes, they had chosen to remain together. It was not a decision born of necessity or fear. It was a deliberate, conscious choice, rare in its clarity and infinitely valuable. The land itself seemed to approve, holding their footsteps in memory and carrying the promise that what was forged here would endure, rooted in trust, courage, and the unspoken understanding that some bonds are stronger than any storm. Spring arrived slowly over the high valley, melting the heavy blankets of snow and revealing the contours of hills that had been hidden for months. The cabin, once stark against the frozen landscape, now looked alive in the soft sunlight. Smoke rose from the chimney in thin, steady curls, carrying the scent of wood smoke and warmth into the crisp morning air. Ethan moved through the small yard with a quiet purpose, tending the animals, repairing fences, and stacking firewood, the rhythm of his work marking the passing days. The valley no longer felt like a boundary pressing in on him, but a space that held life, responsibility, and unexpected companionship. Marilyn moved beside him with a calm certainty that had not been there the winter she arrived. Her hands were steady as she prepared meals, mended clothing, and cared for the small garden that would feed them through the months ahead. The snow that had once battered her shoulders and chilled her bones was gone, replaced by soil rich and promising. Every morning she traced the paths of the fields and the winding trail to the stream, her steps confident, her gaze no longer searching for escape. She belonged here, not by necessity, but by the conscious choice that had grown from winter's crucible. The cabin itself seemed transformed. Its logs, darkened with age and smoke, now glowed warmly in the sunlight. Windows, once frosted with ice, reflected the clear blue of the spring sky. Inside, the fire burned with a steady glow, a companion rather than a necessity, and the space was filled with the quiet evidence of life shared. Blankets folded, tools hung, and simple meals laid out on the rough-hewn table. The house was more than shelter. It was a record of endurance, choice, and the careful tending of trust. The valley remembered the winter in subtle ways, tracks in the melting snow, the scars of frozen earth, the slow trickle of streams once blocked by ice. But it no longer carried the tension or threat of those early nights. Ethan and Marilyn walked the land with hands brushing against fences, with eyes tracing ridgelines that had once seemed endless and isolating. Their presence, together and deliberate, left impressions in the soil and air, quiet but indelible. They had survived what winter had demanded and found the measure of themselves in the endurance of each other. Evening settled over the valley like a gentle cloak. The sun sank behind the distant peaks, spilling orange and pink over the rolling hills. The cabin's windows glowed from the firelight within, and the air carried the subtle hum of life resuming its ordinary course. Children of the nearby neighbors played along paths that had been impassable in snow, and the sounds of distant labor, plows breaking ground, animals moving in their pens, water flowing from the stream, reminded them that life went forward, always. Ethan and Marilyn moved quietly through these rhythms, their footsteps soft, their presence unassuming, but rooted in shared experience and choice. Time stretched, bringing new seasons, but the foundation laid in that first winter remained unshaken. The memories of the storm, of nights spent tending a fire against relentless cold, of the silent courage and stubborn hope that had brought them together, lived in every gesture, every glance, every careful step across the land. They did not speak often of the fear or the uncertainty, but it lingered like a shadow, only to emphasize the warmth and security they had created. Each day became a testament to the decision to stay, the decision to trust, and the decision to love quietly but fully. The high valley, with its pine-covered slopes and winding streams, held their story in its contours. Not a legend for outsiders, not a tale to be sung in town, but a life built from moments that mattered. A hearth kept warm against wind and snow, hands extended in care and protection, eyes meeting with understanding rather than expectation. Winter had brought them together through danger and necessity, but spring, summer, and the years to follow solidified a bond chosen freely, recognized by the land itself. Ethan and Marilyn often paused at the edge of the fields or on the porch of the cabin, looking out at the expanse they called home. The valley had taught them endurance, the land had reminded them of connection, and their shared life had proven that even after storms, warmth and hope could remain. They stayed not because the world offered no other paths, but because they had found a place where they could stand together, where their presence was not fleeting, but lasting. Every day carried the quiet rhythm of labor, care, and the subtle joy of being alive with someone who had become inseparable from the life they were building. The winter that had once threatened to define them now existed only in memory, a reminder of what was endured, what was saved, and what was chosen. They had emerged not broken, but rooted, not uncertain, but deliberate. The valley around them held these lessons as faithfully as it held the river, the trees, and the winds. And in that steady, enduring presence, Ethan and Marilyn discovered that love was not just in grand declarations, but in the quiet commitment to remain, to protect, and to cherish what truly mattered. If you want to hear more quiet stories of choice, endurance, and love without loud words, subscribe to Dust and Devotion Tales. Here, every story begins with a trial and ends with what truly remains.